In 2021, the federal court approved the largest class action settlement in Australian history, worth over $1.8 billion. The judge said that the case had exposed a shameful chapter in the administration of the Commonwealth Social Security system. The lawsuit finally brought to an end an unlawful welfare program called Robodebt. The only problem was that the program had been running for 5 years by this time, and had unlawfully collected $751 million from 381,000 people, some of them being the most vulnerable in our country. It did untold damage to citizens who in many cases had done nothing wrong. This series is a deep dive into Robodebt, but before I get into it, it's safe to say that no one wants to take the blame.
But those opposite have the temerity, the hide, the audacity to walk in and lecture this government on a process they were intimately involved in.
It is a policy and it is a principle that was embraced by the Labor Party, that has been followed by this government, and Mr Speaker, where the circumstances have now presented that income averaging is not something that could be relied upon solely, then the government has made it right.
This government's tried to do what it normally does when it gets caught out, tried to say, well, Labor did it first. This is not true. They were so greedy to chase and prop up false budget surpluses, they saw vulnerable Australians and said, righto, we think we can get away with picking on the poorest and the most vulnerable in Australia, and no one will notice.
The Liberal government was saying that it was Labor's scheme that they had continued, and Labor was blaming the Liberals. But neither side is telling the full story. The term Robodebt has been used pretty widely, but the way I'm using it is to describe what's called the Income Compliance Program, run by Centrelink from 2016 onwards. Compliance programs have been around for ages. Different governments have rightly tried to identify and recover welfare overpayments, and for decades it was all done in a very similar way. The first step is to try and identify possible overpayments, which can then be investigated further. This is done using something called data matching.
Data matching dates back to 1990. It was established under the Data Matching Program Assistance and Tax Act 1990.
Data matching has been around for a long time and by itself isn't an issue. Data matching is basically comparing two sources of information and seeing if there's any differences. The two sources used here is information that Centrelink holds and then tax information held by the Australian Taxation Office, or the ATO. So as an example, if you had Jane Smith who was receiving welfare, she would be telling Centrelink how much she was earning from any employment every 2 weeks. See, welfare recipients often have obligations to report any income they receive in fortnightly blocks. Let's say that Jane was only getting a few shifts per week for the first half of the year, meaning she qualified for welfare payments. During this time, she'll be telling Centrelink how much she earned each fortnight, which is, say, $400. But then in the second half of the year, she gets lucky and finally has more shifts, so she's no longer eligible for welfare. She reports this and her welfare stops. So far, so good. Centrelink systems will show that for the relevant period of time, Jane had said that she'd earned $5,200. This is where data matching comes into play. Centrelink will take Jane's details and send it to the ATO. The ATO would then match that in their systems and tell Centrelink that Jane made $50,000 in that year. To get this figure, the ATO would be using the payment summary provided by Jane's employer. In most cases, this information will be a lump sum for the full financial year. Centrelink then uses what's called income averaging to break this up into fortnights to match the time periods of the data on its own systems. It breaks the $50,000 into 26 fortnights, with Centrelink then assuming that Jane was earning about $1,900 each and every fortnight. Comparing the period that welfare was being claimed, in this case the first half of the year, the system would show that instead of earning $5,200 as she had reported, she may have earned $25,000 and therefore wasn't eligible to receive welfare payments. This isn't accurate, but the system has flagged a potential overpayment that would need more investigation to determine whether an actual debt exists. Many people are casual workers with different incomes every fortnight, or work for multiple employers at the same time but with irregular work throughout the year. The use of income averaging will often falsely flag these cases. Using income averaging to help detect red flags is one thing, but using it as the basis for an actual debt against someone is something totally different. And this is where the problem is. Governments have been using this assumption to raise debts if they have no other information to go off. This is unlawful, something I'll go through later in this series. But the difference between Robodebt and what was happening beforehand is the extent the government relied on income averaging to raise debts. Before Robodebt existed, Centrelink would find about 300,000 possible discrepancies every year from its data matching exercise with the ATO. Out of this bunch, they would then choose the top 20,000 highest risk cases to investigate. Now, Centrelink has always first approached a welfare recipient to ask for further information during its investigation, asking people to provide payslips and other documentation that they might have. But if for whatever reason they didn't have this information, or couldn't properly explain the discrepancy, Centrelink would then go to third parties like employers or banks and request the information they needed directly. This was done using Centrelink's information gathering powers. And this makes sense. Centrelink, in trying to see if there's a real debt, would actually be investigating and finding information to support its assumptions. As a last resort, where information couldn't be found, a debt would be raised using the income averaging assumption. Centrelink's operational guidelines said that this was only to be used if every possible means of obtaining the actual income information had been attempted. But even as a last resort, this still happened quite a bit. A sample check of older debts from 2009 and 2011 showed that this last resort had been used about 20% of the time. Remember, this is the assumption that we now know is unlawful. Because of how easily the debt figure could be wrong, even using this assumption as a last resort was the wrong thing to do, and it looks like it's been happening for decades. People may have had incorrect debts raised against them prior to Robodebt coming into play. The coalition, desperate not to take the blame for the Robodebt disaster, has used this fact to try and distort the truth.
The use of averaged income data started 26 years ago. This side didn't invent it. Indeed, there's no one in this House that invented it. It was invented 26 years ago, but it's this government that has put a stop to it.
That's Liberal MP Stuart Robert, the responsible minister for Centrelink at key points in time. What he's referring to is a Centrelink letter he dug up from 1994, which tells a welfare recipient that income averaging of ATO information could be used as the basis for a debt. And this is all part of a desperate attempt to convince us that the coalition just continued what was already happening before. So the question is, when exactly did Robodebt start? If you listen to the coalition, they keep saying that Labor started it.
They come up with it. These people, these hypocrites, these people who have the audacity to preach integrity from the den of corruption, come in here and tell us that it is all our fault and we should hang our heads in shame when they actually come up with it. It was a scheme that existed under Labor, it was a scheme that existed under the coalition, and it is a scheme that we are now doing away with.
And let me remind the House exactly why the member for Maribyrnong just scarpered out of here like a little boy who's just wet his trousers. And that's because the 29th of July 2011, a media release from the member for Maribyrnong and the member for Sydney, both of them together. Let's read the media release, shall we? And let's come to understand exactly where online compliance and data matching came from. 29th of July or June 2011. Current income compliance program started on the 29th of June 2011 and has continued from that day.
What he's trying to say is that this press release from 2011 proved that the Labor government started Robodebt when Julia Gillard was Prime Minister. Unfortunately for the coalition, that's not the case. Instead, the press release talks about those who are identified as having debts and who haven't made repayment arrangements with Centrelink may have their tax refunds garnished when they lodge their income tax return. In other words, it's a way for the government to recover money from people with already existing debts. It's got nothing to do with how those debts have been raised in the first place, and nothing to do with Robodebt. So let's be clear with when Robodebt started. In 2015, then Minister for Social Services Scott Morrison laid the groundwork by announcing an upgrade to Centrelink's IT systems. He said this would allow it to crack down on welfare cheats. In June 2016, the coalition government under Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull released a policy document called the Better Management of the Social Welfare System. This, and the press conferences that went with it, claimed that there was $3.5 billion of welfare debt waiting to be recovered.
There is some $3.5 billion in debts which are out there in the welfare system.
The government wanted to help its budget by clawing back a huge amount of money through this scheme. From 2016, an online system was developed and some big changes were made with Centrelink's processes. To claw back billions of dollars from the community, the coalition massively expanded how many reviews would be done, sometimes going back many years. While previously there were about 20,000 reviews a year, under Robodebt this would increase to 20,000 a week. But more importantly, Robodebt changed the way investigations of potential overpayments were handled. All this extra investigation would have been really time consuming for Centrelink staff, so instead what the coalition did was to shift the onus of proof completely onto the welfare recipient being investigated. From 2016, Centrelink began sending out letters to current and former welfare recipients for discrepancies dating back to 2010. These letters would require the person to log into an online portal and provide evidence that the ATO income averaged information was incorrect. If they couldn't prove that, then a debt would be raised based on this flawed assumption. 20% of the time, the recipient was able to find evidence to show that there was no debt, meaning the assumption had been wrong. But 4 out of 5 recipients potentially weren't able to provide the needed evidence. And unlike before, Centrelink were no longer using their powers to ask employers and other third parties for the information they needed, even when recipients were having a hard time getting this information themselves. In 2017, when the Commonwealth Ombudsman was investigating numerous complaints coming out of Robodebt, they had this real-life example which showed why the system was so bad. They've called the person H to protect their identity. H received a letter from Centrelink saying that data matching with the ATO had revealed a potential overpayment from years before. When H didn't respond to that letter in time, she was hit with a debt for $5,800. Centrelink was saying that the ATO information showed she had been working for a business for the full year, and so they had used the income averaging assumption and deemed her ineligible for the welfare she had received. In reality, she had stopped working for that business halfway through the tax year when she'd relocated. It was at this point that she had applied and been receiving unemployment benefits until she found her next job. She had already told Centrelink this at the time, fulfilling her reporting obligations. But now, years later, Centrelink put the onus on H to get evidence that she didn't owe the debt, and forced her to try and get payslips from the business. She wasn't able to, because the business had changed ownership multiple times since she had worked there. The report says she asked whether Centrelink could contact her former employer directly, but was told this was her responsibility, and she should complain to the ATO about the wrong information provided by her employer. After months of applying for Centrelink to review the case again and again, it was finally manually reassessed and her debt was reduced to zero. What's worse is that Centrelink had already validated her employment status back in 2010 and had that on her file. See, before Robodebt, a Centrelink officer doing the old manual investigation would have been checking all of these things and would have used Centrelink's information gathering powers to contact the business for information if they needed it. Instead, the false assumptions were used by themselves to raise a debt that didn't even exist. A lot of people had similar issues. Those hit with Robodebt notices were sometimes unable to get payslips and other information for a whole bunch of reasons. Businesses they worked for may no longer exist, or may not have kept that information. I can't imagine how stressful it would be for people barely making ends meet, to then have a debt notice saying they owe thousands of dollars to the government. Safe to say, things weren't going well with Robodebt. And yet, the coalition has been pretending that nothing in the method has changed, and media outlets sympathetic to them have been running with that lie. Listen to Alan Tudge in this interview. He was the Minister for Human Services as Robodebt was being rolled out.
Overall, the system is working as planned.
In relation to the system itself, how different is it to what the ALP did when they were in power?
So effectively, the methodology is exactly the same.
See, what I don't get, if you'd allow me just to make this observation, Alan, with great respect, is that what you're trying to do, I think, is sensible, fair, and what should be done. What the other mob are saying is reckless. Now, you inherited a hell of an economic disaster from the former 3 PMs, Rudd, Gillard, Rudd. And what this is to me, in my mind, as someone that wants to see you fix the budget, is the other side almost sabotaging your efforts to try and get some money back. But they never get bloody well called out on it. It's just so frustrating.
Even Centrelink itself has been pretending like nothing major has changed. In one of their submissions to a Senate inquiry, they said fundamental elements of the department's approach to administering income compliance reviews have not changed. But that's just not true. The Commonwealth Ombudsman's report in 2017 said that while data matching remained the same, the way potential overpayments were investigated had in fact changed. The Law Council of Australia, the peak legal body in the country, also disputed Centrelink's claim in their 2019 Senate inquiry submission. They said there are strong indications that Robodebt had in fact resulted in important departures from Centrelink's prior processes. There is a lot of information on this topic, but the reality is that for decades, a flawed and unlawful assumption was used to raise debts against welfare recipients as a last resort. The Coalition, when they introduced Robodebt, made that assumption front and centre and ramped it up so that hundreds of thousands of Australians were being hit with this shameful scheme. If there are real overpayments, they should be recovered. But forcing people to pay back fake debts is ridiculous. Coming up in this series, there is a lot more to cover. I want to take you through the impacts that Robodebt has had on our community and what the various inquiries have found. And then how the program came crashing to an end and the government cover-ups that tried to delay the inevitable. The one thing that's clear is that a royal commission is needed to get to the bottom of how this happened and how we avoid something like this happening again. Thanks for watching. If you want to help me make more content, please consider checking out my Patreon page, links in the description.